So earlier today, John Barrows released an op-ed in Commonwealth magazine criticizing the policy called rent control. Now, it's important to read this op-ed as nothing more than a job application letter. We know that John Barrows will be looking for work soon because there's absolutely no chance of becoming Boston's next mayor. However, if you want to talk about rent control, let's talk about rent control. Rent control does not refer to one specific policy, but ultimately there's a grab bag of policies which are all used to try to limit the amount that the market just dictates how much rent is. In some states like California and New York, they have a rent control policy where certain units are protected from just market speculation. Whereas in other states like Oregon, there's an overall cap at the amount that apartments can be raised each year. Once the United States in around the 1960s or 70s completely gave up on the idea of housing as a public good and instead wanted to put it just in the hands of the free market, rent control has been constantly under attack because it cuts into the profits that landlords tend to make. One of the most common studies that go against rent control, and the one that John Barrows cited, is this study from San Francisco published in 2019. Basically because in 1994, San Francisco passed a new policy involving rent control, which basically created two different natural pools where you could study the effects that the policy had. And the conclusion of the study is that the areas around the rent-controlled apartments actually had increased rents than areas that never had those rent-controlled apartments. And people like John Barrows will then just point to that simple fact and then say, here is evidence that rent control is bad. However, if you actually read the study, which I have, what the authors conclude is that the reason that the rents increased in certain areas because of the lack of supply had to do with landlords taking advantage of loopholes within the rent control law and then converting their units. So San Francisco had a very weak form of rent control, which allowed their landlords and developers to simply take advantage of loopholes. Also, the authors of the study admit that if you lived in a rent-controlled apartment in San Francisco during this time, you were more likely to stay in your home, which is something that a lot of housing activists and just decent human beings tend to view as a positive thing. And there was absolutely no one calling for this specific rent control used in San Francisco. And more importantly, no one is saying that rent control in and of itself is going to solve every problem we have with housing. All housing activists in Boston want is the opportunity to Boston to decide for itself what rent control policy, along with a long list of other tenant protections, are in our best interest. Right now, we are banned from doing so at the state level. This is all about how much profit will developers and large landlords get to make. People like John Barrows want to make sure that they have unfettered access to limitless profits at the expense of the rest of us, and this is ultimately why he is never going to become Boston's mayor.